riders of a different generation will tell you that motorcycles aren't what they used to be. And they would be right, but the thing is, in their day, maybe riding Hondas through the 70s or Harleys through the 80s or Triumphs through the 60s, well, those motorcycles weren't what they used to be either. Motorcycles are in a constant state of evolution, but there are a few things, a few innovations that have absolutely stuck and will stick around. Things that are as fundamental at this point as round wheels and handlebars. Oh wait, maybe not handlebars. Today we're looking at the innovations that have stuck, unlike the weird features that didn't last, like the propeller motorcycle, which would have been fantastic today for handling those pesky pedestrians. No, these are the innovations that have truly made our motorcycles what they are today. Now, before you get angry with my list, I know there are some things left out. These are just the 10 innovations that I believe to be most important, and I know you armchair motorcycle historians could have a different opinion, which is totally fine. So feel free to share your opinion in the comments below. All right, let's kick it off with number 10, and I think many riders don't realize that the motorcycle company that started it all off in this regard was actually Harley. So for number 10, we're talking about the electric start. It may have taken Harley 3 times as long to make a liquid-cooled engine, but hey, they knew their riders were starting to get too old for kickstarts all the way back in the 50s. Imagine how old those guys are now. Now, technically, there have been production motorcycles featuring electric starts going all the way back to the early days of motorcycling, but it was always sort of a one-off deal. Harley really started it all on big production motorcycles in '64 with the Survey car and going forward with the Electra Glide. Then in the 60s, we also have Honda putting electric starts on lots of their motorcycles. Other notable motorcycles with electric starts were, well, pretty much all of the Hondas from the late 60s onward, especially the CB750. Today, you're hard-pressed to find a motorcycle without an electric start, and sadly, there are a few motorcycles that come with that backup kickstart. Electric starts and starter motors have also come quite a long way as well. The concern early on was that they would go bad so easily or that they just didn't work that great, and then you would have no backup. So again, kickstarters were left on well into the development of electric starters. In terms of electric start development though, and reliability, look no further than the Hondas of the 70s. Honda knew how to make a starter motor from the get-go. Check out this clip of Classic Octane starting up an old barn find Honda, and just absolutely, it just hurts to watch, but he knows that Honda's starter motors are so good and there's no concern, so he just keeps doing it. Just watch it. Number 9 on my list goes to the twist throttle, something that once introduced became the absolute standard and still is today. Early throttles for motorcycles were basically levers. Now, the invention itself does go way back to the 1800s, but it really didn't become standard in the British motorcycles until the 30s. However, it does appear as though Harley was using twist grip throttles way back even into the teens. Harley did some weird things going into the 40s and 50s though, as the British were all now using twist grip throttles that automatically returned. Harleys and Indians in especially the 40s and in the early 50s had a twist grip throttle that stayed where you left it. Some would call this dangerous, some would call it a sticky broken throttle like my Honda that's being fixed currently, but Harley riders would call it cruise control. Regardless, even Harley was forced to catch up with the standard, and so twist and return throttles would become standard for Harley as well. Even today, when we could use a different setup with ride-by-wire throttles, a lot of it is sort of electronic, and also electric motorcycles, it still seems like this is the system that people want and seems to be best. And if you've ever ridden like four-wheelers and three-wheelers and stuff like that, you know that a like thumb throttle, like just a lever, really gets taxing. I remember riding my three-wheeler a lot growing up as a kid, and it really got old after a while. Your thumb would just start to cramp up. So anyways, it's a good system. Number 8 goes to fuel injection. Again, something that has become standard on modern motorcycles, except apparently Janus. How'd you make that happen, Janus? How'd you make a bike that's legal in, I believe, all 50 states that's carbureted? Now, that's not entirely true. We do have dirt bikes, which are often still carbureted. The 50cc two-stroke pocket rockets are pretty much all carbureted, but larger capacity street motorcycles are now all fuel injected, basically, and have been for quite a few reasons. The first fuel injected system for a motorcycle actually dates way back, all the way into the 80s, and even further back for cars, but up until relatively recently, this really wasn't the standard. Many think that fuel injection has replaced carburetors because of, better fuel efficiency or more power, or just because who wants to deal with a choke, but it's actually none of those things for the most part. Really, it's because of emissions. Carburation pollutes more than fuel injection. Say what you want, it's just true. It's not that the system is really that much better or faster or, creates more power. It is easier for sure, but the main thing is emissions. And as you know, though emissions regulations and crackdowns on motorcycle companies do date all the way back to the 70s, it's really the late 90s with Euro 1 that we started to see carburetors die out on street motorcycles. It's easy to see why carburetors are so bad for the environment. I mean, just look at the very design of my 68 Triumph Amel carburetor. The design is literally to dump gas all over the place when you cold start it. Like you literally tickle or press down on this little button until the gas runs out. And that's when you know it's ready to go, when gas just starts running all over the place. But otherwise it's great, But yeah, fuel injection, whether you like it or not, has absolutely been a huge part of recent motorcycle innovation. All right, number 7 goes to overhead valves, and I will also include overhead cams. One time I accidentally said that the knucklehead had an overhead cam instead of just an overhead valve, which, to be fair, is a pretty ridiculous thing to say, but I digress. I know, guys, I'm an idiot. So overhead valves, again, are a replacement of the old design in motorcycles, both British and American. We see again the knucklehead, for example, very revolutionary Harley, repping overhead valves. Not an overhead cam. No, that Harley had push rods like most Harleys. Anyways, we see that system versus the flathead engine from before it, which does not have overhead valves. It has side valves. Flatheads and other side valve systems like we see in Europe in the early bikes basically have valves contained within the cylinder block instead of on the cylinder head, as we see with bikes going forward really from the 40s and onward. Though the British bikes were a bit ahead of the American bikes in this regard, side valve systems are pretty much now extinct, though an homage does exist with the likes of Indian's fake side valve looking engines that are secretly hiding an overhead valve system, which is pretty funny to me. If you want to learn more about fake motorcycle parts, I actually made an entire video on exactly that topic that's popping up as a card right now, so check it out. Overhead cams are a different story, however. Companies like Harley-Davidson have been reluctant to produce overhead cam engines, as pushrod engines really are sufficient for the style of riding that one does on a Harley. Pushrods do lend themselves to low-end torque, hence the reason if you were to compare a Harley to a vehicle, you would pick a truck. Classic American trucks have pretty much always been using this pushrod system. There's not much in terms of top-end revving in a truck, just like a Harley, but there's lots of torque, and if you're going to pull a stump out of the ground with a truck or a motorcycle, that's what you want. You're probably going to pick the Harley if you're going to pull the stump out. You're not going to pick like the Japanese inline high revving 4. Single and double overhead cam systems were available as early as the teens and in the 20s with some racing British bikes, but the standout sort of standard setting motorcycles with overhead cams were really the Japanese single and double overhead cam inline 4s of the 70s. Well, not just the inline 4s, really Japanese twins as well. Well, not just the inline 4s, I should say, like pretty much all the Japanese bikes in the 70s. That setup really changed the industry and pushed it towards utilizing overhead cams as the standard. Number 6 goes to one of the things, like one of my favorite aspects of riding a motorcycle, the clutch. Now we're starting to see more and more motorcycles, even high-end sport bikes with quick shifters and DCT, really making the clutch less relevant or even necessary at this point. But for our purposes, the traditional clutch and transmission setup is basically standard and still is standard today. Originally, motorcycles had the engines just directly connected to the rear wheel, like we have with most electric motorcycles today. And those early motorcycles really were like just big single-speed bicycles capable of about the speed of a professional bicyclist on a bicycle, which is like 25 miles per hour. But it didn't take long to see that this really wasn't a viable system. As engines advanced and became more powerful, motorcycle manufacturers began implementing 3 and 4 and now 5 and 6 speed transmissions. This system of a gear-driven transmission with a clutch became and really is still today the standard, though of course there have been many exceptions. Think the early small displacement Hondas with clutchless sequential shifting gearboxes. Are these still motorcycles? That's the question. I say yes, but for me personally, using a clutch is kind of therapeutic and weirdly satisfying. So I will always take a motorcycle that at least has a traditional clutch. I'm fine with quick shifters and things like that, but I want to be able to use the clutch if needed. And I do believe that electric motorcycles could definitely use a clutch. I think having a clutch has a lot of values, especially in sort of dodgy terrain. But Anyways, number 5 goes to ABS and traction control, and hate it or love it, these safety advancements have changed motorcycling for good. You're hard-pressed, again, to find a modern street motorcycle that doesn't at least offer both ABS and traction control. Both of these innovations date way back to 1988 with the release of BMW's K1. This was an ugly motorcycle, almost intentionally ugly in its absolute focus on technology and performance. Of course, traction control and ABS would evolve, with Honda and other manufacturers in the 90s jumping on board. But the biggest thing in recent years is the price of adding these features. It's really gone down so much that at this point with a modern new motorcycle, it's a no-brainer. Again, I know there's guys out there who think that ABS and traction control are attempts at replacing good riding skills, and I just don't agree with that. I also don't ride a bike that has any of these features currently, so it's not because I think they're bad or don't want them. I just like old bikes, and I like that my old bike weighs virtually nothing because it doesn't have any of these things and other more unnecessary electronics involved. I digress though. ABS and traction control, and now multi-level traction control and cornering ABS, these are good things. They're definitely not leaving us at any point. They're going to be even more standard on bikes going forward, and even cheap motorcycles will have things like cornering ABS probably in the future. All right, number 4 is a bit general, but I'm going to say suspension. Now again, we could say things like upside down forks or telescopic forks. There's been loads of innovations in this area, even including things like electronically adjustable suspension and monoshocks, old tech like plunger suspension. We could also include just the whole idea of a swing arm and how that relates to suspension. But to sum it all up, the idea of taking these stiff, rigid things that are on two wheels and making it so that the parts, namely the frame and your butt, are protected from bumps and lumps in the road by a spring, it's pretty genius, and at this point it's absolutely essential. The need for suspension was obvious pretty early on as motorcycles became heavier and more powerful. It wasn't just that riders were having their literal teeth vibrated out of their heads at any speed over 40 miles an hour. The actual frame and engine could not withstand the extreme conditions of the roads, and imagine how much worse the roads were then. Suspension in motorcycles went through all sorts of changes, as we mentioned before, and today there's lots of different ways that you can set up a motorcycle, from a softer, more off-road setup capable of withstanding more undulations and even the impact of landing from a jump, to stiffer on-road setups, or even more stiff track setups, better for high-speed cornering and braking. This is one of those things that's obviously never going away and will continue to be improved. And out of everything we've mentioned so far, I would say this is the thing that has evolved probably the most. Okay, number 3 on our list goes to carburation. Some of you thought I was going to skip this one. The carburetor was, and as we noted earlier, is still an integral part of the combustion engine process, namely induction. And as we noted, it's not necessarily that fuel injection is that much better in terms of overall power or fuel efficiency. And carburation went through many different iterations, from very basic setup early carburetors that have a few moving parts and are small, to more sophisticated carburetors and carburetor setups, things like my Honda 500, for example, that has 4 carburetors that's set up on this big mechanism. I'd be curious to hear from you guys who've ridden lots of carbureted and fuel-injected bikes. Which do you prefer, and what really are the differences in terms of feel? Let us know down below. All right, number 2 on our list. For this one, I'm going to go with liquid cooling in its various forms, from oil-cooled to completely liquid-cooled engines. For most of motorcycling history, the problem of heating was dealt with by utilizing the readily available cooling created from the air passing through and around the motorcycle, which is pretty genius. And in general, this was a sufficient solution, and still is a sufficient solution for many motorcycles. But as motorcycles got faster and more powerful, they created even more heat, coupled with the need for more aerodynamics. So passing that cold air directly to the engine just kind of became impossible. This is also related to overhead valve systems. There's a lot of reasons why liquid-cooled engines became such a thing. Motorcycle engineers needed to keep the valves, which are now on top of the combustion chamber, from basically burning up in their location, and they soon realized that using the engine oil to essentially cool the valves actually worked really well. There was also the problem of varying temperatures, not only in weather for riding, but also in the engine itself, as the engine on an air-cooled system would be cooler at lower speeds, but then when you got going really fast or rode more aggressively, the engine would heat up to extreme temperatures. And I can really feel this when I ride my old Triumph. When I go 65, 70 miles an hour for, say, 15 minutes straight, the bike starts to really feel hot. And this affects performance, definitely. A fully liquid-cooled engine, though not without its difficulties over the past few decades as it became such a thing, has solved quite a few problems and really helped to advance motorcycle engineering as a whole. On to number one, and number one for me goes to disc brakes. One, if not the single greatest innovations in terms of motorcycle safety. Disc brakes, in comparison to their predecessor, drum brakes, are literally better in every way. And even though they date back to the 60s with massive improvements along the way, we still really have not come up with a better system for stopping a motorcycle. Early disc brakes were actually a bit rough and really didn't do the job that much better than drum brakes, and especially were not good for big, heavy, fast motorcycles. That is really until Honda released their CB750, repping a front and rear disc brake and doing the job, well, better than any drum brake setup could have done. And I know this personally, again, as an owner of an old motorcycle that has drum brakes front and rear, and going from that to my new 1973 Honda CB500, which has a front disc brake. Even with that early technology, that disc brake has significantly more stopping power, considering also that it's not only a more powerful motorcycle, it is a heavier motorcycle. Now, disc brakes have evolved like crazy, and in combination with all of the other important braking innovations, with just one finger, you can stop a modern motorcycle so much faster than you can a similar sized bike with that older technology. ABS certainly has saved lives, but nothing has saved more lives than disc brakes, in my opinion. They've also made it so people maybe ride stupider. Like, people expect the bike to stop quicker. Also, maybe helmets have saved more lives. I don't know. I know disc brakes have done a lot of good for motorcycles. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed this. Again, I know there's probably some disagreement here, and I'd love to hear from you down below in the comments. Let us know what you think the most important innovations are in motorcycle history. Thank you guys so much for watching my videos. I can't believe how well this channel has done and how many views I'm getting and how many subs I'm getting. Like, the other day, I got like 300 subs from you guys, which is incredible. So thanks for supporting me. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next video. Ride safe.